Welcome to Just Break Up, the podcast about love, heartbreak, and all the relationship advice you don't want to hear. My name is Sierra DeMulder.
And I'm Sam Blackwell. And this week we're going to tackle the topic of white supremacy.
Yes, we are.
For sure. And before we begin, we're going to give you our Surgeon General's warning, which is that we are not licensed mental health therapists. And also...
we are white.
Right? And we are... going to continue to have uncomfortable conversations about race on this podcast.
Yeah. And for those of you who are like, oh, dang, this is a relationship advice podcast. Why are they talking about racism? We could unpack that on like so many different levels. But first and foremost, Sam and I want to. This is, this whole global conversation was instigated by a murder that took place in our beloved city of Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. And we feel like it is not only our duty as white people, but it is a privilege to talk about racism and white supremacy instead of experiencing it through micro and macro aggressions and acts of violence. And we all know, as part of the mental health advocacy community, that racism, oppression, violence, all of this has an impact on our mental health. And to say that these are not interconnected is not allowing us to be the multifaceted people that Sam and I always say that we are, right?
For sure. I think, throughout the last week or so, 2 weeks, I've really been thinking about, our place as white podcasters, speaking to an honestly predominantly white audience, and what that means and what our whiteness brings into this conversation. And I've been struggling with sort of how do we talk about this in a way that is adding to the conversation and not centering ourselves or our whiteness. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in that is just like coming back to what I think are the values of this podcast. And what we talk about a lot, which is that we want people to be able to make their own choices about themselves and the people in their lives, right? We talk a lot about consent. We talk a lot about boundaries. We talk a lot about autonomy. And the reality is that none of those things can exist where there is not liberation, right? We cannot be actors in our own and make our own decisions when there are systems of oppression that exist. And so you may think like, what does this have to do with dating advice? But the reality is that every part of that is connected with liberation. We, as white folks, have the ability to make informed and autonomous decisions about our bodies in a way that people of color aren't able to do because of the system of white supremacy. And so if we want to live in the world that we always talk about, where people are able to make decisions about who has access to them and what their bodies can and can't do, we absolutely cannot do that until there is liberation in this country, not just for white folks, but for every person. And so when I came to that realization in our conversations about this, it was just such a mind-opening moment to say, like, we need to be talking about liberation as part of autonomy, consent, boundaries, and we haven't been. Like, you and I have really let that issue, like, not come up in our conversations. And it's on us from this moment forward, and I'm making a commitment to do it, to continue to talk about that in every conversation that we have, right? And I was thinking about this episode and I was really afraid it was going to be like this is a special episode of Just Break Up, right? Like it's going to be that episode of Golden Girls where they all wind up in the homeless shelter and realize that like homeless people are people too, right? Like that's not what I'm going for. Like I want this episode to be more of a commitment to us having these conversations, not just today, but every week, every time we answer a letter, and being really intentional about it too. So that is my commitment from this episode. It's not just a today thing, but an ongoing thing for Sierra and I to continue to understand our whiteness and the ways in which our whiteness color the ways that we answer questions, color who our audience is, and realize that we need to be changing the way that we have these conversations.
Absolutely. And before we get into the conversation, we want to acknowledge that a lot of sources, whether it be the media or commentary on Facebook, a lot of people are centering the wrong thing. They're talking about the property damage. They're talking about, they're debating all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. And before we get into our conversation, we want to center what this is truly about, which is the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and countless others at the hands of the police, and the systemic racist history of police brutality and violence. And we want to make sure that their murder and their lives are at the are the purpose of all of these conversations and not forgotten. I think I also want to just say, like, the not the caveat, but the background of Sam and I talked all week about what we wanted to say and accomplish in this episode. Mm-hmm. And there's so much that we could do, both we could say or not say, right? Like, we talked a lot about how we are just going to be another a set of two white voices contributing to this conversation, when we all should be looking to the voices of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color right now. So, at one point, Sam and I were thinking, okay, we're not going to do another episode. We're just going to point people places. But we've also been, I think, something that has really been brought to the surface over the past couple of weeks is the idea of whiteness, of white people talking to other white people about systemic oppression and racism and violence. And I have been particularly moved by the idea that I've heard in lots of places, but particularly from one activist and writer named Sonia Renee Taylor. I've shouted her out in a past blind date way back, maybe in our first 20 episodes. Sonia Renee Taylor is the author and founder of The Body Is Not an Apology, which is basically a radical guide to self-love. And we're not talking about like, wow, I just like love my curves, radical love. We're talking like that fat phobia and racism are inherently connected, and ableism is connected to, she's an amazing teacher and has really moved me. And recently she brought up a conversation about how all of these white folks are now having conversations with their parents or friends or whatever, arguing about either Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter or whatever, the history of police brutality. And she posed the question that, yes, we should be having conversations about racism and how other races are oppressed, but more importantly, we should be having a conversation about what whiteness is and how we as white folks are so complicit with the violence and the history of violence, and the idea that we are even debating it, right? That what does it mean to be white? Well, to me, I look at that and I think, dang, like what it means to be white is to know that people of color are being murdered by police regularly, and to still say, well, what was he doing? Or, well, it's just one bad cop. And that sort of like turning of the head, like the willful acceptance of that is a sickness, like we talk about racism as a sickness, or I've heard that analogy before. And I think in the past, people have thought of it as like hatred is a sickness, right? And I'm gonna like one up that and say that I think apathy and complicity, is that the right word? Complicity is the sickness right now, because we're so used to learning about racism in terms of black and white photos that feel like hundreds of years ago, right? When in reality, Martin Luther King was murdered 50 years ago. And that racism doesn't just manifest in like hatred and Nazism, but instead it manifests in these small microaggressions, these subvert small acts of white supremacy. And I think what I'm going to commit to our podcast, I guess, in addition to your commitment to liberation, is to really think about what does it mean to be white, and what is stopping us, or what is keeping us in this place of power, because there's a lot of things going on there. I know that's not the most articulate thing. And I really encourage everyone to check out Sonia Renee Taylor. Sonia with a Y, Renee, Renee, Taylor, Taylor. That's her full name on Instagram. So it's and Sam and I always talk about discomfort, right? Like how growth happens in discomfort. And the true discomfort for me has been not just the pain, outrage, and exhaustion that I have seen on my friends of color, my Black friends, my community members, but the violent complicity that I've seen in my friends and family and in myself. Like, what am I okay with at the hands of other people? You know, the suffering of other people. Like, what has happened to where we don't? I'm going to trail off there. Evers.
For sure. No, and I appreciated in that that video that you're talking about was that question of turning the question back on ourselves, right? Instead of saying like, oh my God, I'm debating whether or not folks should be killed by police officers. Instead, looking inside and saying, what is so sick about us that this is even a debate that we're having, right? Like what kind of world have we constructed as white folks to say that like we get to have this debate about whether or not Black people should be killed by cops? Like what sort of system have we set up where we are the arbiters of the value of other people's lives? Or even just consider ourselves that, right? Because we're not. At the end of the day, white supremacy is a delusion, right? There is nothing inherently better about white people. And yet we operate under that assumption and have created so many systems and government to enforce that, right? And I appreciated that rephrasing of it so much. And I think that is something that we need to be doing as two white hosts of a podcast about mental health, about relationships, about how people move through the world in relationship with other people, to be having those conversations about turning those questions inward on ourselves and asking, what lies have we been telling ourselves? And what is the sickness in us that needs to be ripped out at this point in order to fight for that liberation that I am committing to continue to fight for?
Right. And I want to say, we are going to shout out like a blind date that we would like you all to check out this week as an act of solidarity, as an act of self-unlearning. But I also want to say, you know, another thing that Sam and I we stumbled over when we were trying to figure out what we wanted to say this week was that everybody is coming at this week at this global conversation with different tools and experiences. And that's true, right? Of everything we have ever talked about on this podcast. And we didn't, you know, it's hard to have a conversation about dismantling white supremacy when maybe somebody doesn't believe it, right? Doesn't understand how it manifests or has yet to be shown a reality in which they believe it or whatever it is, right? So I want to call in our white listeners a little bit and just say, if you are feeling shocked or lost or confused or conflicted or whatever feeling that you're feeling, welcome. That is part of the process. And also, there are so many resources out there that Sam and I could point to that show that all of this is real and that we are no longer going to commit the violence of white supremacy that is denying that. And if we don't believe what is out there provable, not just by statistics and history and facts, but by people's lived experiences, then we are being willfully violent and complicit, as I said before.
For sure.
So we didn't want to it's like, do you get into racism and white supremacy 101, or do you jump to what you authentically feel? And right now, what Sam and I authentically feel is this is this is the level at which we want to participate in the conversation. But if you are feeling overwhelmed and confused, there are so many resources out there, especially right now, that will help assist you in this education and unlearning of white supremacy.
Absolutely.
Oh, and one of them, the whole reason why I started this, one of them that is so great, I put it on our Instagram. There's lots of conversations about it right now, but just because a lot of people are talking about it doesn't mean it's like too mainstream or cool for you. It is the, sorry. That's a real part of human beings where they're like, they hear it talked about too much and then they like, well, I'm not going to watch it.
For sure. Yep.
It's the documentary 13th that it was put out on Netflix, but it is now free on YouTube right now. It's both on Netflix and free on YouTube. That not only gives us a great overview of the history of racial inequality in our country, but it provides context for how our racial inequality is now connected to our justice system, our prison system, and policing, and how that has impacted Black and brown people for the last several hundred years. And it provides great context for what's going on right now, and I encourage you to watch it. That is the end of my small pitch.
Great.
Yeah. Do you want to shout out a blind date for this week?
Yeah, I do. So Sierra and I have decided that we're not going to read any letters this week. And instead, we are going to ask you, with the 45 minutes to an hour that you would normally spend listening to us answer people's letters, to find...
Let's be honest, it's been like an hour and a half lately.
Yeah, like 7 hours of letter answering. Is that we want you to check out a resource. So it's Brené Brown's podcast, actually, which is called Unlocking Us, right?
Yep, Unlocking Us.
Yep.
Right?
Yep, which is Brené Brown. We talk about her all the time, but she has an interview that was released on Wednesday of last week, with Ibram X. Kendi, who is the author of How to Be an Antiracist, which is a book that I've shouted out quite a bit, and was a very transformative book for me. So would love for you to take the time to listen to that conversation with Ibram and Brené, and spend some intentional time for that 45 minutes to an hour, really listening, interrogating, reflecting inwardly, and understanding that, I think for a lot of us, this impulse of like, I don't know what to do. I don't have any tools in my toolbox to be able to join this fight or to have these conversations, and to say that, Black folks, Indigenous folks, people of color have been telling us, white folks, what to do for a very long time. And I think that Ibram Kendi's work is a prime example of tons of tools at our disposal about how to be an active anti-racist. And what I appreciate about his work is that it is both a personal process in terms of how do we unlearn the things that we have learned, how do we untell ourselves the stories that we've committed to telling ourselves, and also it's about bigger change too, bigger work. How do we take what we've unlearned and bring it to the seats of power that solidify and support white supremacy, right? And so would encourage you to listen to that instead of this. To this week, we will hopefully be getting back to reading more letters in the future. But again, with this commitment that Sierra and I have made to bring liberation, to bring anti-racism into our conversations, and the way that we examine what folks are going through in their interpersonal relationships. And I do want to say one of the things that Ibram Kendi talks about a lot is that there is no race neutral, right? It is either you are acting and thinking in a racist way, or you are being intentionally anti-racist. And I think one of the things that have struck me in the past 2 weeks is how Sierra and I have been talking about sort of progressive things, but have never really made the declaration or the intention of being anti-racist in this podcast, right? And are now committing to that, right? We are going to be an anti-racist podcast, and we are going to not just skirt around the issues of race, but actively talk about them and combat them.
Absolutely. And I want to add, Sam and I are trying to be very concise about what we talk about today, because we know we can't unpack it all, and we want to be specific about what we talk about, what we cover. I want to just add one more thing to this conversation is, which I think has been really brought to the surface the past couple of weeks in these conversations, is that to be racist is, like I said earlier, it is not the polarizing thing that we have thought of for our entire lives, meaning it's not just Nazis versus peaceful, nice people, right? Nice does not equal anti-racist.
Right.
And I think the huge thing about white people, a huge thing about me, right, that I really struggle with is I always want to be nice and I always want to be loved so much. And so the idea of being told that something I did or believed was racist would crush me and would crush a lot of white people that I know, which is a phrase that the author Robin DiAngelo came up with, which is called white fragility. And I want to shout out her book too, White Fragility, but add to the conversation that that will help our listeners, our white listeners, kind of unpack this or move through this, is that what Sam says and what it says in the book, How to Be Anti-Racist, is that since we have grown up in this system, it doesn't matter how nice you are, we all have racist ideas, thoughts, implicit biases, things like that. And that the conversation is not, are you a good person? It is, how are you combating these ideas? That you can be a good person with a racist bias, right? You can be somebody who donates to 1,000 charities who has a racist bias. Like, that's the complexity of human nature. And to truly dismantle white supremacy, what Sam and the work we're trying to commit to is to say all of these things are true, and we will not be so fragile that we will not look at our own truth, our own beliefs, and that we will instead work to be a wholer, more authentic, good person instead of the good, nice person on the surface. A good person, a nice person does the work, right? Admits when they're wrong, changes their mind when they're brought new information. Is there anything you can add to that to wrap it up nicely?
No, I would just say all of that. And these are things that we have been taught, right? But they are also things that we have, as white folks, have intentionally believed because they serve us.
Yes.
Right. So it's not just that our third grade teacher taught us that Christopher Columbus was a good dude, right? It's that we intentionally believe racist things because acknowledging the anti-racist things would mean that we have to
and would disrupt our idea of ourselves.
It would mean we would have to forfeit power, or it would mean we would have to give up something that has been important to us, or that idea of like who we are. And so, do you want to just say that as well? Go ahead.
Yeah. It makes us truly question our understanding of our goodness, but I want to disconnect them. That, like, to be nice, again, is not anti-racist. Anti-racist is to be actively dismantling these ideas, these systems of power in our world and in ourselves. And I just want to say again, there are so many resources out there right now that I have either read in the past or have read just this week that have truly added to my tool belt, my constantly insufficient tool belt too, because as a white person, we will always have to do this. This is a commitment that we are making because we no longer want to be so violent and complicit.
For sure.
Yeah. Sam and I could say, we could say so much right now. But in addition to other resources out there, there's a lot of conversations. Make sure that you are interrogating the sources that you are getting your information from. If you are not just like national news, because firsthand accounts have been much more well-rounded and true. But also, are we listening and uplifting the voices of people of color and Black people of their lived experience?
Absolutely. And I would just say to wrap things up is just a reminder that this work isn't about us white folks feeling better, right? It is not self-work in the way that I think sometimes we talk about self-work, right? It's not about bubble baths and and a glass of wine, right? The end goal here is not that we as white folks feel better. The end goal here is liberation.
Absolutely.
And so we need to keep that in mind, especially as a self-help podcast. Like we need to really interrogate that and make sure that we're calling that out as often as possible. Because this self-work that we're asking ourselves as white folks to do is not about us feeling better or being like more authentic, whole people, right? It is about dismantling the systems of white supremacy and helping to support the creation of liberation for Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
Absolutely. Before we do our sign off, we want to ask our wonderful Just Break Up Head and Heart Worker community out there to put their money where their mouth is, as some people say. There are so many great places that are being uplifted to be donated to. And there are also so many places that are greatly in need. So don't stop just at this one recommendation, but we didn't want to flood your timeline with places. We just wanted to point you in one place. But don't let your giving stop there. But we Just Break Up want to uplift the work of the Loveland Foundation. You can find the Loveland Foundation at thelovelandfoundation.org. And it was established in 2018 by Rachel Cargill, who is an amazing voice on Instagram right now, an amazing organizer, a Black woman who gave Sam and I the language that we've been reminding ourselves of. This is not self-help work.
Absolutely.
This is not about us feeling good. It's about the liberation of Black people. And we, the Loveland Foundation, in short, provides therapy, free therapy or scholarship therapy for Black women and girls around the country. And it is an effort to bring opportunity and healing to communities of color through fellowships, residency programs, listening tours, and more. We donated all of our current ticket sales for our postponed birthday show to their therapy fund. And you can too contribute whatever you can, because if we all, again, change happens with small personal change, right? So if everybody who listens to the podcast donates $5, that is a lot of contributions. So whatever you can, give to the lovelandfoundation.org, but don't let your giving stop there. There are so many places in need right now, and there's so many great organizations and voices that are being uplifted right now. Thanks for listening. Thanks for participating. Sam and I love this community, and we want to be the best versions of ourselves for that. And again, we don't want to just be like good people. We want to be active participants in what we believe in our quest for the liberation for ourselves and others. And remember that discomfort is a part of every growing process. It is okay to feel uncomfortable. It is okay to question your preconceived thoughts and beliefs. It's okay to readjust your opinion and approach once you've learned something new, to change your mind, to grow, to stand up, to use your voice. But the end goal isn't that we as a community feel better. It's not that we as a community can pat ourselves on the back. The end goal is the liberation of all people. It is not just equality, but true equity and justice. And as Nina Simone defines freedom, no fear. And if all else fails,
just break up.